We often imagine Vikings as fearless raiders, warriors with axes raised, storming monasteries and villages, burning and plundering their way into history. That image is true, but it's only the beginning of the story. What came after the fighting was often far more terrifying. For the men who fell in battle, death was final. But for the wives, daughters, and mothers left alive, the ordeal was only just beginning. Their suffering was written not in sagas, but in bones, in laws, and in the silent remains of markets and graves scattered across northern Europe. The truth is this: for Viking women, and especially for the women of defeated peoples, capture was a fate worse than death. And what those women endured was not random cruelty. It was deliberate. It was systematic. It was built into the very structure of Viking society. The sagas and chronicles often fall silent about these women. They describe the great raids, the battles, the treasures, and the kings who fell. But the silence hides something darker. Archaeology, genetics, and fragments of law codes fill in the gaps, painting a picture that is both shocking and undeniable. When the shield walls broke and the warriors fell, the women were seized. They were chained, sorted, priced, and distributed. Some were sold in the Greek slave markets of Dublin or Hedeby. Others were taken as forced wives, their consent irrelevant, their futures erased. Some were sacrificed in grim rituals, their deaths meant to honor the very men who destroyed their families. And some, perhaps worst of all, were made examples, punished in ways designed not only to break their bodies, but to terrorize every captive who watched. This story isn't only about violence in the heat of battle. It's about an organized system of exploitation that endured for generations, shaping entire societies. And as chilling as it is, the evidence survives in chronicles and bones, and even in our DNA today. Take the monastery at Clonmacnoise, was one of Ireland's most sacred sites. When Norse fleets descended, monks resisted at the altar, but were cut down where they stood. The chronicles describe their slaughter, then stop. What happened to the women after the battle isn't recorded. But the ground beneath Dublin tells us the answer. Archaeologists uncovered the remains of a slave market, chains fitted for women's wrists, ankle rings sized for children, storage buildings large enough to hold dozens of captives. The Norsemen weren't just taking treasure. They were taking people. A wife, once captured, became property. Not a person, but a commodity. In some markets, prices were coldly calculated and carved into stone: 20 pieces of silver for a young woman, 15 for a mother, 10 for one injured in capture. These were not exaggerations. Runic inscriptions in Schleswig record such figures, receipts of human lives etched permanently in stone. But to be sold could almost be considered fortune. For many, the fate was far worse. In 862, raiders stormed the settlement of Portmarnock. Chronicles mention the number of warriors killed. They say nothing about the women. Soil tests from nearby bogs reveal the truth. The remains of more than 20 women were uncovered, each showing signs of deliberate violence. Skulls fractured from behind, forearms shattered in defensive wounds, ribs broken by repeated blows. These were not chaotic deaths in battle. These were executions, carried out after the raid, after decisions had been made. The pattern repeats across centuries. In 871, the great heathen army captured Reading. Chroniclers focused on the defeat of King Ethelred, but they left out the fate of the royal women. Excavations at the Saxon palace revealed stains of blood residue on stone, enough for dozens of deaths. The stones tell the story the words refuse to. The Viking system wasn't chaotic. It was legal, codified, and ruthlessly efficient. In Norse law, the wife of a slain warrior automatically became the property of her husband's killer. She was not considered a servant nor a free woman. She was a forced wife. stripped of choice, voice, and future. The Old Norse word for such a woman was kona, literally owned woman. The law codes of Iceland, preserved in texts like Gragas, spelled out the rules. A captor had to declare ownership publicly within 3 days of capture, or rivals could contest his claim. Women were fought over like livestock. The laws made forced marriage legal, and any children born from it were legitimate in the eyes of society. Assault wasn't just tolerated. It was written into law. And yet, forced marriage wasn't the worst possible fate. In 878, Norse raiders destroyed the monastery at Bangor. The Irish annals record its fall, but archaeology reveals something darker. Burned layers at similar sites contain fragments of women's bones arranged deliberately. Ritual demanded that when a great warrior died, so too did his horses, his weapons, and his women. Ibn Fadlan, an Arab traveler in the 10th century, witnessed such rituals firsthand along the Volga River. The ritual rape and killing of a slave girl at her master's funeral. Archaeology confirms his account. Both burials across Scandinavia contain female skeletons with signs of strangulation, blood trauma, or drug traces in their teeth, evidence that they were subdued before being killed. Imagine the horror. A girl dazed with henbane, hallucinating, compliant, carried into the grave to die with her master. This was not a rare event. It was a ritual embedded in culture, and the suffering was not limited to women. Archaeological digs at Viking camps reveal infant bones, many bearing signs of blunt force trauma. These were not stillbirths. They were killings. Viking law was clear. If the mother was a slave, the child was a slave. If a child could not work, it had no value. And so it was destroyed. Brutal economics shaped the fate of the smallest and most vulnerable. Population studies in England show gaps where Norse settlements existed. At Repton, where the Great Army camped in 873, excavations revealed hundreds of skeletons, most of them men. But only a fraction were women, and isotope analysis shows those women weren't local. They were captives, carried from Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Those who died of disease or childbirth were buried. The rest vanished into the slave routes. Dublin, the great Viking town, was not only a port but a hub of human trafficking. Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, reveals continuous rebuilding of docks for over 60 years. Each new pier meant more space for ships, more warehouses for human cargo. These weren't temporary pens. They were long-term storage facilities for people, drainage channels. In the stone floors weren't for rainwater. They were for human waste. From Dublin, captives flowed outward, some to Norse farms, used as breeding stock. Others shipped east into Islamic slave markets, where pale-skinned women were prized as rare luxuries. Arabic chroniclers described Viking caravans reaching Baghdad itself. Rune-carved ship manifests list women as cargo alongside amber and furs with chilling precision, 20 women per ship, the standard load. But captivity was not the worst fate. Punishment awaited those who resisted. Excavations outside Dublin revealed pits designed for prolonged torment. Skeletons of women were found with broken legs and shattered arms, injuries inflicted to ensure they could not escape or end their own lives. These pits were shallow enough for air, deep enough for imprisonment. The women died slowly, crouched in agony, sometimes for days. Viking law codes confirm it. A slave woman who harmed or killed her master was to be buried alive. But the burial was not swift. Stones, water, or sharpened objects in the pits made sure the death was prolonged and agonizing. Captives were often forced to watch, learning exactly what defiance would bring. As Viking expansion spread, so did this system. The Norse were not alone in their exploitation. Christian rulers, when they replaced Viking power, inherited the same infrastructure. The Domesday Book of England records women listed as property alongside livestock. Archaeological evidence from Norman castles reveals holding cells designed specifically for women. The continuity is undeniable. What began as raiding evolved into an organized economy of human trafficking. With established trade routes came reliability. Merchants promised delivery dates for captives as if they were livestock. Byzantine treaties record slave prices by category. Young women highest. Pregnant women discounted. Children under 10 nearly worthless. It was a market as precise as any modern supply chain. By the 10th century, this system was deeply entrenched. Even genetic evidence today testifies to it. In Iceland, 60% of female ancestry traces back not to Norse women, but to Celtic captives taken in raids. In Norway, nearly half of female ancestry originates from the British Isles. These were not migrations of free women. They were the forced unions of conquest and captivity, repeated across generations. And sometimes, the evidence is even more horrifying. In York, known to the Vikings as Jorvik, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a building dated to the late 9th century. Inside were dozens of individual cells, chains bolted to stone walls. Saw layers showing decades of use. The women held there bore signs of repeated pregnancies. Their bodies discarded once they could bear no more. This was no prison. It was a breeding facility, standing in the very heart of the town. Church baptismal rolls record hundreds of births linked to the site. Only a handful of those children survived beyond childhood, most vanished. Sold into servitude, the profits flowed directly into church construction projects. The church was not only aware, it was a partner. Records from York Minster list regular payments to the operators of these facilities, contracted fees for services rendered. This was not hidden, it was accepted, normalized, woven into the fabric of society, even when Viking power waned. The suffering continued when Norse towns fell in England. Mass graves of women appeared executed not by enemies, but by their own people. At Repton, a grave sealed in the late 10th century contained over 200 female skeletons. Isotope analysis showed they were Norseborn. They were not captives. They were the wives and daughters of Vikings themselves. Why would men kill their own families? Because they knew exactly what awaited captured women. Because they had inflicted it on others for centuries. And so, when defeat was inevitable, they chose to kill their own rather than allow them to be taken. One skull bore a runic inscription carved after death, "Better this way." A grim justification written in bone. The chronicles fall silent. The sagas never mention it. But the ground testifies. Archaeology fills the silence with undeniable evidence. Across Scandinavia and beyond, women's voices were erased. If they resisted, they were punished. If they bore children, those children were commodified. If they spoke, they were silenced. Some were driven mad with mercury compounds before execution. Others were sacrificed. Their deaths staged as ritual. Many simply vanished into the machinery of captivity. Their names lost forever. But not all were passive victims. A few fought back. In Frankish records from the early 10th century, a woman named Gunhild appears. She had once been a Norse captive. Freed, she turned Viking methods against them. For years she led war bands, targeting Viking camps, destroying slave markets, and freeing captives. Chronicles credit her with the destruction of a dozen outposts. Her methods were brutal: no prisoners, no mercy. She knew the enemy, and she knew what they feared. After 930, her name disappears from the records. But archaeological burn layers across Viking territories suggest her legacy. Someone was hunting Vikings. Her story is rare, but it proves something important. Resistance existed. Women did fight back, but the overwhelming system of captivity and exploitation crushed most voices. What the Vikings did to defeated women was not only cruel, it was systemic. It was codified, ritualized, and normalized. It wasn't just about raiding villages or conquering kingdoms. It was about harvesting people wives, daughters, children, turning them into property, into breeding stock, into commodities for sale. When we look back at Viking history, the sagas glorify warriors and battles. Modern culture often romanticizes them as fearless explorers. But beneath that image lies the unspoken reality. The Viking Age was built not just on plundered gold, but on the suffering of women, and the traces of that suffering endure in graves, in laws, in chronicles, and in the very bloodlines of Europe today. The next time we imagine the clash of shields and the storm of raids, we must also imagine what followed. For when the fighting ended, the true nightmare began.